in a sport where you're not as strength dependent, you may benefit from doing 25, 30% of your 1 rep max faster.
You're listening to the Ethos Athletes podcast, where we believe that your health is the #1 resource you need to accomplish your dreams. My name is Dr. Matthew Hernandez, and I'm a physician dedicated to helping my patients maintain their active lifestyle and continue doing what they love. I'm sitting down with other experts so that we can provide our listeners with the knowledge they need to improve their health and live their best life. Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Dr. Matthew Hernandez, and you're listening to the Ethos Athletes podcast. Today, we're going to be continuing our weight training series with August Schmidt. In the past 2 episodes, we've talked about how to train for hypertrophy and how to train for muscle endurance. Today, we're going to be discussing how to train for power. August, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Dr. Matt. I'm excited to be here to do another episode with you.
We've had a lot of good feedback over the last few episodes, and a lot of it actually had to do with people giving feedback on the fact that this particular series has really helped them manage their expectations as far as when we're training. For instance, I had one person who gave us feedback where she's a personal trainer up in Scottsdale, and she does training with some men, and a lot of the times they're training for power and for hypertrophy, and the guys can sometimes feel bad or don't feel great when they finish a workout and they're not just completely exhausted lying on the floor. And what we've learned thus far is, depending on what the goal of training, we have different expectations as we go, and how our body is used for each of those. So that's been some really good feedback we've had for this particular series. Like I said, today we're going to be discussing how to train for power. So, August, can you tell us a little bit, what does that mean when we talk about training for power?
Well, first thing to address is just the expectation that people have of how they should feel after training, like you're talking about. You'll encounter that a lot as a coach or a trainer, is that people expect to be destroyed at the end of the workout. They want to be exhausted and know that it did something, which is different than necessarily training for an effective outcome, specifically if it's more towards the side of strength, power, speed, something along those lines. It's a perception of how they should feel afterwards. But if you're training properly and you're training for purposes of stimulating speed, strength, power, any of that, you may not feel wrecked when you leave a lot of times. As you get more experienced with training, you'll be able to recognize the fatigue that you're experiencing, because it's probably going to be a lot more nervous system, connective tissue, things like that will be fatigued, which is very different than something like doing a CrossFit or a HIIT intervals or something like that, where you have something that's very obvious that you're tired and that you worked hard.
Yeah.
So it depends on why you're working out. The training to where you're just exhausted and you did something, a lot of that meets some emotional or psychological need just for the exertion and for the knowing that you did the work. And if that's why you're training, that's totally fine, because you're training because you enjoy that feeling and you want to feel that, and it works out your anxiety or stress or whatever it is that you have going.
Yeah.
But it may not be the most effective way if you are training for a specific outcome. Mm-hmm. So that's just kind of separating the two. Why are you training?
I think it's a good point to make, and this is something that I've personally experienced when I've gone from doing something like a CrossFit workout where, it's fast-paced, you're doing a lot of reps, and I just feel, like spent and like you said, feel wrecked at the end of it, where I'm laying on the ground. And then in other instances where I'm training more for strength, and when I work with a personal trainer, and I'm doing these motions where I'm doing these exercises where I don't feel, like you said, I don't feel wrecked. I'm kind of like, okay, well, yeah, I guess I lifted stuff. I know I actually did motions, right? But I don't feel super sore the next day. It's sore enough, but nothing that, I'm like having trouble getting out of my chair or anything like that.
Yeah.
As I go and continue to train, I notice that I'm lifting heavier weight, with less issues, stuff like that. So it is getting past that expectation.
Yeah, and if that's your objective, then you have to go into it knowing that it's going to feel different than doing something that metabolically just wrecks you, and you have the runner's high afterwards and all that.
Yeah,
it's a totally different thing. It just has to align with what your purpose for training is.
Yeah.
So when you're training for acceleration or speed or power or something like that, the workout may be relatively low volume and it may be relatively short and you may have a lot of rest, but if that's going to effectively give you the outcome you're looking for, then that's the right way to train. You just have to go into expecting that and understanding that that's what it's going to be like. That's what the experience is going to be.
Yeah.
So it's just a different thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm happy that we were able to kind of shed light as we're doing this podcast series, just because I think it helps a lot of people really understand that and understand why their bodies may react a certain way after a specific type of training.
Yeah.
Let's go into chatting about power. Tell us a little bit about what we mean when we say we're training for power.
Okay. Yeah, it's important to define what we're talking about when we're using words like power. Firstly, there's strength, which is basically just your ability to generate force without consideration to time. So it's moving something heavy, and it doesn't matter if you're moving it slowly, you're moving it. Speed is moving from point A to point B as quickly as possible. And power is a combination of the two. The definition of power is force times distance divided by time. So in other words, how much weight are you moving, how far are you moving it, and how long does it take you? And the faster you're moving the weight, the longer the distance or the heavier the load, any of those three variables, you can push your power up.
I think that's a really good definition. I like how you broke that down. So I'm assuming that as we discuss training for power, which we'll jump to in a little bit, we can control those different variables, I would imagine, and how we train.
Yeah, you can control those variables through the load, the resistance that you're using, the number of reps that you're doing, the rest that you're taking, the speed that you're intentionally putting on the movement. Mm-hmm. You can manipulate all those variables to get a different training effect. Before we go into a little bit more detail on that part, let's talk about when would we want to train for power and when isn't it ideal or maybe not necessary to train for power? Well, it's just identifying the attributes that benefit you the most in your sport. So if you're training something that requires high power outputs, football, Olympic weightlifting, short sprints, things like that, power is going to be crucial. If you're doing an Ironman, power output is probably not as important. They're going to have a relatively lower power output for an extremely prolonged period of time, and they're probably not doing much of what we'd consider necessarily true power training. Theirs is more developing the ability for a sustained submaximal effort. Mm-hmm. Which is what we talked about in the last one where we're talking about muscle endurance. When we're looking at training for power, so we're looking at three different variables, so force, distance, time. Let's talk about the variable of force. What are the different ways we can manipulate that particular variable when we're looking at training? Force is going to just be how much force you have to put in something to overcome the inertia to move, so you can move it. So that's heavy weights. When you're training for heavy weights like that, you're typically going to use low reps, long recoveries, not as much volume. But again, when you train for most sport, you're going to probably, to some extent, periodize your training. So you're not always training at 90% of your one rep max, or you're not training in that range all the time. Mm-hmm. That will be, if you're doing a strength sport, will be a priority. But you'll do other types of training to develop an increased capacity to develop force. Okay. When you're talking about force and speed, you can put them on, or velocity, you can put them on a force velocity curve. Okay. And basically, as one goes up, the other goes down. Okay. So the more force you're having to generate, the lower the velocity is going to be. The higher the velocity is going to be, the lower force you can generate. That makes sense. When you're training for power, you want to kind of find the sweet spot where those two overlap and give you the highest point on your power curve. Okay. The relationship between those two. That's going to vary a lot depending on what the task is, right? Depending on what the movement, what the movement is, what your body mechanics are. Generally speaking, if you just used a mathematical equation on just a muscle contraction, mm-hmm. then you're looking at developing your highest levels of power. In other words, the most force and velocity combined is going to probably happen at about 30% of your one rep max on a particular lift. There's a lot of variables in that, and that's not probably the most effective place for a lot of athletes to train for power. Yeah. As the movements get bigger and more complex, so as you go from like a bicep curl to a clean and jerk or to a snatch, that relationship changes between the velocity and the force. Okay. And the percentage of your one rep max that's going to create the highest power output is going to be different. Also, as you get stronger, you shift that power curve over so that you're at a higher percentage of your one rep max. Okay. For an Olympic weightlifter or someone like that, you may spend the bulk of your training time in 70 to 85% of your one rep max, and that's giving you an optimal stimulus for developing power. Okay. If you're doing a sport that's less strength dependent, then maybe you're doing a lower percentage of your one rep max and higher velocities. Okay. Because at some point for weightlifting, doing super fast snatches with 25% of your max probably isn't going to do much to affect your ability to lift heavy 1 rep maxes, which is the test of a performance in weightlifting.
Right.
So you have to be higher up on that scale. In a sport where you're not as strength dependent, you may be able to do most of your training you may benefit from doing 25-30% of your 1 rep max faster.
Okay.
It's very dependent on what your demand that you're training for is.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like that you gave a general rule of how to go and interpret it, and that way me as someone who's wanting to train for strength, it can go and follow that. So and it sounds like it was you can be 70-80% of a 1 rep max, and you kind of work around that.
Yeah, and that again varies on the movement.
Absolutely.
So maybe bench press, maybe that sweet spot for power output is 50-65%.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to depend on the athlete and other variables. But if you look at like Westside Barbell, they do what they call dynamic effort,
mm-hmm.
which is repeated submaximal explosive movements. So like on the bench, maybe they're doing 8 to 10 sets of 3 reps at 55 or 60%.
Okay.
And that's to develop that power. It's getting all the muscles involved in the movement to contract extremely forcefully all together,
okay.
like more close than they would if the movement was done slowly. If you're doing it slowly, they can kind of one contraction and then there's the next thing engages and next thing. But if you're doing it really fast, everything is having to fire fairly simultaneously and you're developing high power output.
Okay. And obviously there's the repetition behind that goes and builds more neurological pathways to make those muscles contract all at that same time as well.
That's a huge point.
Right.
A big part of power is going to rely on your nervous system's ability to express that movement in a very short period of time.
Right.
And the way that you get better at expressing the movement very quickly is going to be to do that movement repeatedly, exactly the same way that you're going to do it each time. So it's exactly the same perfect movement every time. That's laying down that neural pathway, and your body can send a stronger and stronger signal as you do more and more reps with it. You become more efficient, and you can move more weight.
Yeah. I think this goes back to our basics of weight training that we talked about in the first one. You kind of gave some rules on when we're looking at weight training. And one of the things that I follow, and this may or may not be correct because I'm not I weight train to a degree, but not like, you in your case, right, where you're a coach. Anytime I'm going and looking at doing specific lifts, and again, I do my best to train for strength, but getting that neurological pathway to me is so important, especially from preventing an injury standpoint. You can start with, or at least the way I do it, is I start with a lower amount of weight just to run through the motion several times, and I kind of train that way until I feel like I have that efficiency down for that movement, and then kind of go up from there.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's exactly right. You should never add load to a movement that isn't right. Mm-hmm. I liken that to, trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it.
Right.
The fire, is the problem in your movement, and the load is the gasoline. And you're adding more load to a bad movement, it's going to get worse. And that's not helping you because, number one, it's wear and tear on your body. A good movement should be pretty efficient and not damaging to your body. Every time you do it, you're laying down that neural pathway. So you're either laying down a productive, useful, repeatable neural pathway, or you're doing it different every time, and you're not building that nervous system for the purpose that you're training.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Training for power or strength, when we're looking at this aspect, obviously it's sport dependent, so on different movements. But in general, if you wanted to do a general workout for your body in increasing power and strength, what are some of the movements that you should at least consider when you're thinking that kind of help, maybe with total body or various things like that? When
you're training to affect your ability to generate power or to express power through your body, you are going to want to try and get it so that you're using big multiple joint complex movements, because that's how you're going to be able to express the most power, most force through a deadlift, a squat, a bench, a clean and jerk, a snatch, those types of movements. That's where you're going to have your highest power outputs because it's a big movement and you're moving bigger weights. So that's where you want to train. So you're training structurally. I don't know how much value there is in doing a lot of emphasis on power training and single joint movements. Right. Like, I'm not sure how valuable it is to see how fast you can do your curls. Right. It's probably going to benefit more in a complex multiple joint movement. Yeah, like you said, going and working on a single joint or a single muscle like that, I mean, realistically, that's more of a hypertrophy training at that point, right? So we're going to switch over the type of Yeah, it would be
all that.
A lot of that would probably be hypertrophy training, some strength, depending on what the purpose is. If you're trying to train your biceps to help you with pull-ups, maybe you're doing some strength work, maybe muscle endurance work, depending on what you're training for.
Right.
But yeah, we'll usually keep the power stuff to multiple joint movements.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I mean, then these are all, just to go and put it in relation to outside of a sport. I mean, power movements are what you need in almost your daily activities, right? I mean, this is when we're talking about like lifting, like a bag of soil or whatever it is, like if you're trying to garden or, going and lifting a desk, different things like.
Yeah, most of those are going to be structural and they're going to be multiple joint movements, a little more complex. Again, it depends on what your day-to-day life is. Another reason to do the larger structural multiple joint movements is that it's just going to be a more potent stimulus to your body systemically.
Right.
It's going to elicit more change in your bone density, your connective tissue, your nervous system, your endocrine system, your metabolism.
Yeah.
It's going to stimulate more of a change in that.
And I think that's an important point to make. I mean, and we've talked about and we've referenced the benefit of weight training on metabolism in a previous episode, and how mitochondrial production is important for that. Mitochondrial production is going to occur the most when we're going and training for power like this. And so, again, we're using whole body movements for the most part, multi-joint movements, and you're going and increasing the amount of weight that you're doing over time with this. And so you're able to get more mitochondrial production, which, again, benefits the body as a whole and gives the most overall impact when we're looking at that piece. What other considerations do people need to have when they're thinking about training for power? Is there things that they shouldn't be doing that you commonly see, like different mistakes that they may be making when their goal is this and they're thinking that they're trying to train for that, but they're actually not doing it because of a mistake they're making?
Yeah. There's a lot of things that can kind of fall into that. Probably the first and one of the most important would be the quality of the movement. You're generating lots of force and strain on your body when you're doing high-power movements, so you want to make sure that those movements are done efficiently and you're maintaining good position so that you're not damaging your body. You don't want to make them so that they're too far disassociated from the function that you're going to be training for. So doing a medicine ball clean on one foot on a Bosu ball is not going to be an effective way to develop power. It's going to be an effective way to get better at doing a medicine ball clean on one foot on a ball. Right. And it may help your balance a little bit or stabilization and things like that, but it's not an effective way to train for power because your power development is limited by the variables that you put into it. Yeah. Of just using a ball and being on one foot and being on an unstable surface. So you could use that as a warm-up or a skill thing, but I don't see that there's going to be much transfer in terms of power.
That makes sense. One of the things that we mentioned before we started this particular recording is that I'd like to ask you a little bit more about is when we're looking at training through phases. So you can have, like, let's say you're going and setting out for weight training, you can have a hypertrophy phase. You can kind of combo that with endurance phase, different things like that. Can you speak a little bit more about what that looks like and why you would do that?
Yeah, that can basically be referred to as periodization. That's one type of periodization. In that case, you maybe would do a phase where you focused on hypertrophy. This is kind of like your general preparation phase and trying to hypertrophy the muscles so that they're primed to develop more strength when you come into a strength phase. It also just prepares your body for the work so that it's not overstrained when you're going with the heavier stuff. It's getting your connective tissue ready, your nervous system ready, your muscles ready to do that heavier work. So maybe you do a phase of hypertrophy, then you do a phase of strength so that you're developing just your raw strength. You're converting that hypertrophy into strength. And then you may roll into the next phase where you have a bias towards power, where you're converting that strength into power that you can apply to your sport. Okay. So that's kind of the concept of that. Yeah. It also just makes your training varied so that you're not doing the exact same thing over time and it's losing efficacy or you're getting bored. Okay. The concept of what you just laid out makes sense to me. I mean, you prep the muscles. I mean, from someone that treats injured athletes all the time, that it makes sense. Prep the muscles, build strength in that, and then start working into the complex movements. Yeah. And I mean, you can do it other ways. There's other ways it works. There's arguments against doing it that way. But that's one way of doing it and applying the principles that we're talking about to your training. Can you give an example of what another type of periodization may be? Well, you can either do it where you say we're not doing periodization, where you're doing like the conjugate method that the Westside talks about, which is away from the classical periodization model, where they're doing their dynamic effort consistently throughout this, and then they're shifting through their max effort or their max reps or any of those movements or training styles, they're switching movements very frequently. So maybe they'll do dumbbell incline press for 2 weeks and then switch to a machine press and then to something else. So they're switching through them very quickly.
Yeah.
Just because they're getting the stimulus that they wanted out of that movement, and then it's not really stimulating much change after a couple weeks with an experienced athlete. So then they switch to something different.
Okay.
And all those things should be assistance exercises that are contributing to performing better on the competition lifts.
Awesome.
With a less experienced athlete, there's going to be a learning curve on new movements. So the first time that they're doing the movement, they're really learning the movement. And they're not effectively able to maximize their effort and output in that movement because they're still learning it. Then you have to give them more time with those movements, and then you can change once they've maxed out what they can do with that movement, change to another assistance movement. But an experienced athlete that's done these movements lots of times, they may only do it for 1 or 2 weeks and then switch to something else.
Okay.
But they're keeping their competition lifts dialed in by doing the dynamic effort, which is dynamic effort in that competition lift. So they're getting tons of reps and work in that movement.
Okay.
But they're not doing it super heavy. They're just explosive.
Right. Again, it goes back to the high repetition, goes back to training that neurological pattern, which again will ultimately impact how explosive they are.
Yeah. And so kind of the parameters for training for power is that you're going to do lower reps. It'll probably typically be 2, 3, 4 reps, somewhere in that range. You'll do them explosively. You'll do them with perfect movement, and then you'll recover.
Okay.
And then do them again. And your loading will be sub-maximals. You can get a device that you can measure your power output on a movement. You'll put a sensor on the bar, and it'll measure how far you're moving it and how fast you're moving it, and then you plug in how much weight it was, and it'll tell you your power output.
Okay.
So you can do your own research and figure out where your maximum power output is.
That's cool.
Just doing it with different loads.
Yeah.
So you can find out where you're hitting the most power.
Okay.
But again, it's doing repeated efforts sub-maximally, getting adequate recovery, and doing the movements perfect with a focus on emphasizing speed.
In this episode, we've talked about training for power specifically. And we've discussed the formula behind power, talked about the velocity curve and the relation to that. And then, like August just mentioned, going and doing repeated effort, submaximal lifts, it's going to help. Is kind of the baseline of how to go and train for that piece. Now, in the next episode, we're going to be discussing training for strength. So we'll dive more into that on the next episode. But August, can you kind of give us an idea? Power and strength may seem like the same to a lot of people. Tell us a little bit of what the difference is between the two. That way we can have a better understanding of that.
Strength can just be thought about as being able to generate force, and without a consideration to how fast you're doing it. So you do a 500-pound deadlift and it takes you 5 seconds. Power is generating high force, but also generating it fast. So when you're training for power, you need to develop your strength. Otherwise, that's the limiting factor.
Right.
You can move it fast, but you can't move heavy weight, so you're not really that powerful. But you also need to train for velocity, and then you've got to do a lot of your training in the middle there at that power. Okay, because your strength will be heavier and slower. Your power will be right in the middle, what we're talking about when you're training for power, and your velocity will be lighter and faster. So you got to train all three of those things. If you neglect to train for strength, you're going to limit your upper limits or your ability at the top end of what you can lift, especially if you're a competitive weightlifter or something. You have to do strength work, particularly in things like squats and pulls. You have to have your body accustomed to handling those weights, and you have to push your strength up because the stronger you are, the more power you can generate. But you can't just train super heavy and slow all the time, or you won't be able to generate the velocity, and so that's going to limit your power.
Yeah.
So you have to address both.
Okay.
And so that kind of accounts for where weightlifters are training in most of their work, what percentages they're at, probably 70 to 85%. You do have to touch heavier weights so that your body is able to handle them, and so that it's prepared to handle them, and so that psychologically you're ready to feel what that is. But you can't spend all your time training at 90% or above, or is something like that. You'll develop bad movement patterns, and you'll get slower, and you'll probably overtrain pretty quickly. Again, that varies from athlete to athlete, and all the variables that go into that. But yeah, you have to address what you're trying to accomplish with your training. So you got to have your strength, you got to have your speed, and then you got to combine it into the power. Yeah,
that makes perfect sense. And it goes back to the equation that you gave earlier. Power equals force or strength times distance divided by time, right? So today we discussed power, training for power, what that looks like. on the next episode, we'll discuss training for strength and really honing in on what that looks like as well, and just kind of elaborating more on what you just discussed. Awesome. Well, August, thank you so much for being on this show again.
Thank you.
We look forward to catching everyone on the next episode.
Wanting to look youthful and age gracefully? Our team at Ethos Aesthetic Medicine love working with individuals who want natural-looking results with minimal downtime. Our Ethos Glow approach is designed to help you show up as your absolute best self by giving you brighter, more even, and youthful-looking skin. Ask our team how you can get more information on our Ethos Glow approach to achieve natural-looking results that make you shine.